Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with ELIE MYSTAL. He's the justice correspondent at The Nation magazine, an MSNBC contributor, and we're going to talk about a lot of the justice and law issues and Supreme Court issues that are in the news, but we're also going to talk about his first book, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. On Freeform, we explore the lives and the work and the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, provocative approaches to politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, and more, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Pacific, streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Podomatic.com, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net. Now, simply with what's going on these days in news and stories involving the Supreme Court, it would be a good time to turn to today's guest. There's the recent shadow docket decision citing the Republican state legislature in a Wisconsin redistricting case. There's the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to succeed Stephen Breyer, the Senate hearings, her prospects in the vote, what she means in terms of not just color or gender, but experience, philosophy, temperament. There's the aggressive and blatant involvement of Ginny Thomas in the Stop the Steal movement and the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and the calls for Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from any cases involving the election and the insurrection, and the attention the Thomases have drawn to the lack of ethics rules with regard to Supreme Court justices. Then there are specific cases before the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, some upcoming involving gun rights, and of course the conservative court's efforts to defend religious bigotry. And then beyond the Supremes, there are other prominent stories of law and justice. The recent finding of a federal judge that it was more likely than not that in his attempts to overturn the 2020 election results, former President Donald Trump violated the law and, quote, corruptly attempted to obstruct, unquote, Congress. There's the unwillingness of new Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg to pursue prosecution of Donald Trump for financial crimes. There's the rise in violent crime nationally and the corresponding rise in the politics of fear and the impact that this is having on calls for public safety reform in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the national Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. And finally, there's the broad and entrenched powers of minority rule that dominate government in the U.S. from top to bottom, from rural state houses to the Senate to the Electoral College, etc. That would be more than enough reason to call on ELIE MYSTAL, but we are also going to talk about his book. The book, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, opens with these words. Our Constitution is not good. It is a document designed to create a society of enduring white male dominance, hastily edited in the margins to allow for what basic political rights white men could be convinced to share. He goes on, the Constitution is an imperfect work that urgently and consistently needs to be modified and reimagined to make good on its unrealized promises of justice and equality for all. Adding, it was written by a collection of wealthy slavers, wealthy colonizers, wealthy anti-slavery white men who were nonetheless willing to compromise and profit together with slavers and colonizers. At no point have people of color or women been given a real say in how it was written, interpreted, or amended. And he contrasts what one might call the ideals or the principles of the Constitution with its actual applications in the real world. Quote, many of the rules, rights, prohibitions, and concepts are actually pretty decent. The problem is they've never been applied to all of the people living here, not even for a day just to see how it would feel, but serve only as a mocking illustration that the white people running this place know the right thing to do, but simply refuse out of spite to do it. And he makes clear that his goal in writing the book, to expose what the Constitution looks like from the vantage of a person it was designed to ignore, to illustrate how the interpretation of the Constitution that conservatives want people to accept is little more than an intellectual front for continued white male hegemony. And allow me to add this fact, no other subsequent democracy has chosen to adopt our Constitution. We proudly claim it's the oldest constitution of a democratic republic, blah, blah, blah. But many, many countries have written constitutions since then, and all of them have found that ours needed to be improved. Why then do we pretend it's not so? Mistal actually goes so far as to make the political choice to call the U.S. Constitution trash. He's done this on talk shows and so on, which naturally has stirred up attention and reaction. And I can imagine, certainly, Republican politicians will add that phrase to their litany of cultural and moral sins of the left, of MSNBC, and of the Democrats in midterm campaigns. And let me make clear that the energy or attention aroused by a few words and an irreverent but deadly serious attitude in this case cannot be brushed off as being taken out of context. Mistal says what they say he says, and to a fair extent, he means what they say he means. It was the Constitution agreed to as a workable structure by a slave-owning and slave-dependent group of white men and the states that they represented, and so of course it needs work. And Mistal believes that the attitude of almost religious veneration promoted by the right and agreed to by most of the left makes it difficult to deeply challenge this, what is in origin a white supremacist document. ELIE MYSTAL is justice correspondent for The Nation magazine, legal editor of the More Perfect podcasts on the Supreme Court for Radiolab, a contributor to MSNBC. He's a graduate of Harvard and Harvard Law. He was for 12 years executive editor of Above the Law, and we're going to talk, as I said, about his first book, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Welcome, ELIE MYSTAL, again to Free Forum, a world that just might work.
Terrence, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And by the way, I mentioned some of the issues in the news to remind people just how much questions about the law and the Supreme Court matter. Our attention these days may be to a great extent on what's going on in Ukraine or whether the pandemic is coming back and how careful we need to be. But this stuff is vitally important and very alive right now.
Yep, and it's all around us. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book. It was, the word guide is an operative word in my book title. I really want people to read it and to be able to use some of the arguments I make against, the conservatives or Republicans in their life, in part because I think the Republicans have done a very good job of controlling the narrative in terms of what our Constitution means, in terms of what our rights are, in terms of who gets to interpret our rights and why and how. They've done a great job of controlling the narrative around that, which is a problem because their solution or their outcomes are extremely restrictive, right? They're restrictive on human rights, they're expansive on gun rights, and they don't allow, I think, for a more equal, more just, and more fair society. So that's a huge reason why I wrote the book. Just to give people, I mean, your opening was so good about just the breadth of issues and problems we have in this country. My book is really kind of a primer for how do we think about some of these problems from a constitutional perspective, and how do we fight back against the Republicans who are dominating our discourse and culture at the moment.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I said towards the end there, that it's venerated by the right, but sort of that veneration is accepted by what goes for the left in this country, and I would say certainly by the Democratic Party, but also it's sort of, there aren't that many people that start off an argument about justice or the law with a serious questioning of the Constitution. It's kind of a, let's take that for granted, like it's the Ten Commandments, and now go on from there.
Yeah, so there are two things here. One, it has been actually a little bit surprising to me just how much blowback I've gotten for saying that the Constitution is a little bit trash and not very good and desperately needs updates and reforms. It's a somewhat self-evident point, okay? If you just think about it this way, if you and your friends got together and went to government camp and you made a little document to run a society, to build and create a society, and less than 100 years later, the society that you created with your little document got into a hot civil war where 70,000 of your compatriots died. That would be a demerit, right? Like that would be, that would be an indication that maybe your document didn't do everything that it could have to create a society. Our Constitution was essentially had to be reformed after the Civil War. Those reformations, the Reconstruction Amendments, those worked so ineffectively that we had to have another civil uprising essentially in the 1960s to even make the amendments that we fought over real to us, right? There are many problems inherent in the Constitution that desperately need fixing. We don't directly elect our president. I mean, that's just dumb. Like, what kind of democracy are you running here?
Well,
You don't even
let me jump in for 1 second there, because this, as you know, my minority rule is one of the things that that makes much more than my head explode. But that fact that we don't elect the president by popular vote has led to, as people know, 2000 and 2016 people who did not win the popular vote being elected president. And the thing that I like to remind people is that the Republican Party has won, there is only one national vote in America, and that's the vote for president and vice president. And the Republican Party has won that vote once since 1988, and yet they have held office for 12 years, and they have appointed a vast majority of Supreme Court justices. One of it is bad rules, and one of it is bad luck. Go ahead.
Right. So the Republicans' candidate for president has lost 7 of the last 8 elections by popular vote. And
so that tells you what where the nation actually stands, the people of this country.
Exactly. And yet our Constitution does not provide for a way for the people to actually elect their president. Our Constitution provides for equal suffrage in the Senate for states, not people.
Right.
But states have equal rights in the Senate, not the people living there, right? Which is why you have a situation where Wyoming has as many senators as California. A stat that I like to use, if you looked at how much voting power a single person in Wyoming has, if you count their one congressman that they get, even though they probably technically shouldn't even have that, their 2 senators, and their electoral votes for president, one vote in Wyoming is worth 58 votes in California. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, and that is set in stone by our Constitution. So when I say the Constitution is kind of trash, I'm being kind of generous, right? Like I'm being, I'm being realistic about the structure that we have, that it has built. It is one that is not fair. It's certainly not democratic, and it has a lot of, I think, somewhat obvious problems.
Right. All right. And what you're doing there is you're adding sort of point 2 to point 1. Point 1 is if you just look at its origin, how it was written, that it was a compromise, that these slave-owning states would agree to a structure with the states that were not as dependent on slaves. That's the origin. But then you point out it isn't just that group made a perfect document. Things like the Electoral College and several other aspects just are in need of reform.
100%. Like even if you think that the founding fathers did the best they could, what they did needs updates. And then you can go back to point 1, which is, and they didn't do the best they could, right?
Right.
A lot of pushback that I've gotten from this book has been people saying, well, the founders tried their best, and it was a different kind of time. There were people of their time. Yeah, there were other people in real time who told the founding fathers that slavery was bollocks and needed to be abolished, right? The old world, still living under, for the most part, kings and queens, was like, how are these Americans talking about freedom when they are slaveholders? Like, how does that even work? That was weird from a European perspective, that these white, rich colonists would think themselves so high and mighty about freedom when they were slave drivers. People in Europe knew in real time that slavery was wrong. People in America knew in real time that slavery was wrong. They were just willing to make deals with slavers. And then the people that never come up when you talk about, like, could the founding fathers have known how terrible their slave system was in real time? You know who else knew that it was wrong in real time, Terrence? The enslaved people.
Yeah.
If they had asked any,
right,
they would have said, hey, this ain't right. This isn't freedom. This isn't what I signed up for. Right? They didn't even ask. So the idea that another stat that I didn't even learn until recently from Mike Duncan's book about Lafayette. Do you know who the largest largest slave owner was at the time of the Revolution in
Well,
America?
it turns out because of your book, I do, and this was actually the next question I was going to ask you.
Right?
So
That's George Washington.
Let the listeners know, Ellie.
It's George Washington, folks. He was the largest slaveholder at the time of the founding. So, like, to put that in context, the idea that, slaveholding George Washington and slaveholding James Madison and slaveholding Thomas Jefferson created something enduring that has stood the test of time and doesn't need to be fixed. It's just ridiculous notion, right? It's a ridiculous point of view. I haven't even gotten to talking about women yet, Terrence, right?
That's right.
Like
That's
50%
right.
of the American population also just excluded from not only the conception of rights, but also the conception of who gets to have a say in what rights are given. Completely excluded 50% of the population. Again, this document needs some desperate work.
Yeah, and just to remind people, because I forget myself, women did not get the vote until what year in the 20th century?
The 19th Amendment, so like 19, what was it, 1919?
It's 1919, 1920, right in that area. I mean,
Right.
imagine that. In the first 20 years of the 20th century, with the electric light and all that urbanization and everything, women did not vote. What they thought and felt mattered nothing.
And remember, that's just white women.
Oh,
Like, that was
exactly.
just white women who didn't get to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment. We didn't get voting rights for women of color until the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
Right?
Right.
The passage of the Civil Rights Act was the first thing that made voting real for women of color. So again, and it doesn't just stop there. I've written that in the book that you got to also think about the amendment process, right? Everybody wants to say, like, it's okay that the Constitution was bad originally because it can be amended. Let's talk about amendment process for a second. First of all of the amendments to the Constitution have been written predominantly by white men.
Mm-hmm.
The amendments process requires a majority vote in Congress and the Senate and passed by the president. So far, for the amendments that we have, all the presidents have been white. The Senate has been dominated by white men. The Congress has been dominated by white men for the 27 amendments that we have. They have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Do you know how many state legislatures have been majority minority in American history?
I believe it's one once. Am I correct?
No, it's 0 majority minority, once majority women.
Okay, yeah,
that was Nevada in 2018.
Yeah.
So again, black people and people of color and women have never even had a say in amending the Constitution, writing new clauses into that document. And then, of course, we can talk about interpreting the Constitution. The Supreme Court claims supremacy to be the final arbiter of what's in or isn't in the Constitution. That, by the way, Terrence, not in the Constitution.
I understand. That's right.
Right? It's just the power of the Supreme Court.
Judicial review was invented by the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, it was just 1803. The Supreme Court was like, yeah, I think it's going to be us who gets to have the final say on the Constitution. And the other two branches were like, all right, okay. Because we got bigger fish to fry, we're going to let you have that, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to say that the Supreme Court has the final say on what is or is not constitutional, then I think it becomes relevant that we've had 115 Supreme Court justices in American history, and 108 of them have been white men.
Wow.
Right?
White men.
Exactly. So the people who write, interpret, and enforce the Constitution have been almost exclusively white men for all of American history. Again, folks, that's not good. That's not how you should do things.
That's right. That's two things. One, it's not America. It's not the look or the actual population of America. It never has been. But also, as you point out, there's a nuance that I mentioned in the introduction, which is that you say there seem to be ideals or principles, concepts in the Constitution, but that the actual actions taken in the real world, based on the Constitution, do not reflect and have never reflected those principles.
Yeah, look, there are some ideas there that are awesome, right? Free speech, love it. Freedom of the press, couldn't have a job without it.
That's right.
Equal protection of laws, 14th Amendment, pretty decent. Prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, 8th Amendment, that's fantastic. Too bad we don't do these things.
That's right. That's right.
Universal suffrage is awesome. Do you know we have never been through an election, not one, where everybody who was eligible to vote actually was registered to vote and thus easily able to go vote, right? That's never happened in our country, not even once, right?
Yeah.
We don't do a good job of banning cruel and unusual punishment. We don't do a good job of even defining what that is. We see equal protection be ignored in so many different areas. Like the ideals in the Constitution are fine. They just haven't been applied to everybody living here equally ever.
That's right.
So
ever.
Yeah, I understand, and here's something that's worth saying. I think I do understand at some level why our Constitution is highly regarded in our country. Part of the thing about America is that no matter what Tucker Carlson says, we are all immigrants. We all came from somewhere else, unless you're a Native American. Some of us came more willingly than others, but still, we all are fundamentally immigrants. We're not unified. We're not bound by a shared race or a shared ethnicity or a shared religion or a shared creed, right? The thing that binds America together is the idea. The idea of America stitches us together way more than a race or a religion or anything like that, as they have in the old world. And that idea is represented in our Constitution, right? So like that's why our country kind of reveres its document a little bit differently than France, which is like on its what's like fifth.
Right, or Italy, has had like 130 governments in the last, yeah.
Italy throws theirs out every time it gets like cold in the rain, right? So like because they're Italians, they have something that brings them together beyond their governing documents. Same with the French, same with most of the countries in the old world. We don't have that. So I understand it, part of the reverence. What I don't get is people who revere it without wanting to make it real for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't revere the American dream to the point that you are blinded to the fact that that dream is a nightmare for so many people. That dream has never been extended to so many people, right? If you're going to revere the American dream, then you got to spend kind of every waking hour making that dream relevant and applicable to everybody who lives here. And we don't do that.
That's right. That's right. If what you love about America and why you revere the Constitution are those principles, are those ideals, and the fact that you could create a country connected by ideals, then it seems to follow that what you would want is to do everything in your power as citizens and as a government and as a nation to make the lives of Americans embody those ideals.
You gotta fight for it, right? Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, one thing I want to throw at you just to give you a chance to respond to it is, I looked at some of the reactions on the right to your book, but I don't think it's necessary because they read the book. I think it's because they saw you on TV or saw a clip of you on TV where you referred to the Constitution as trash. We've already talked about where that assessment comes from. But Ben Shapiro, very, very popular right-wing podcaster, he counters you with Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, in which Douglass says, "Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery." So this is Ben Shapiro saying, where do you get off making such a big deal of the fact that it was written by slave owners or by those who were happy to do business and create governments with slave owners.
Yeah, so Ben Shapiro is doing this thing, and this is actually pretty common amongst right-wing, white-wing commentators. They find a quote from one black guy, take it out of context, and try to change that quote to mean whatever the hell it is they want it to mean today, right?
Yep.
Frederick Douglass gives that quote in the context of trying to figure out how to reform America. Now, early in Frederick Douglass's career, so he escapes from slavery, teaches himself how to read, becomes active in the abolition movement. Early in Douglass's career, Douglass was an anti-constitutionalist. He was a strong person who said that the Constitution basically was trash and needed to be reformed. What he realized was, as he was going through the politics of it, is that that argument wasn't getting traction, and that it was easier to make the abolition argument on the idea that the Constitution was great and it was just these evil white people who were ruining it for everybody, right? That was a strategic change that Douglass made to win the argument. I think that it was probably a smart strategic change at the time. You're dealing with a generation of white men who are closer just in time scale to the actual founding fathers. I mean, we're talking about a generation or two at most removed from the founding of the country if we're talking about the Civil War era. And secondly, you're talking exclusively to white men. Right, so telling northern white men, your white people constitution, it's actually pretty awesome. It's just these your cousins that are screwing it up for everybody.
That's right.
That's a good political strategy. I'm a fan of that strategy. Sure, he was wrong. I mean, he was great on the strategy, but like in terms of the actual document, no, the document was not bereft of any slave clause. In fact, the original Constitution counted enslaved people as 3/5 of people, so that's a real obvious point where the Constitution has written the one that Douglass is talking about, by the way, because this is before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That's a great indication that the Constitution was in fact pro-slavery. Another great indication is that Article 5 actually used to contain a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. Like, people know the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. They know that was bad. That meant that, like, even if you escaped, you could be returned to a state of bondage by any white person in the North. The South would demand a return of their property. That act didn't start in 1850. That was an updated act in 1850. That act started in the Constitution. There is a fugitive slave clause in the original Constitution. So as Frederick Douglass is talking about how great the Constitution is, he knows that the Constitution provides for his recapture and re-enslavement. So yes, it was a very, very smart political tactic for Douglass to say those things, and I probably would have adopted the same tactic if I was in his position. But in terms of what the document actually says, no, it's a pretty obvious slave document.
Yeah, no, that 3/5 clause is just, I mean, it doesn't exist without slavery, and it doesn't exist without the need to preserve slavery. Let me tell people, this is Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with ELIE MYSTAL. He's the justice correspondent at The Nation magazine, an MSNBC contributor, and author of the book we're talking about, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. You can learn more about a lot of his thinking, a lot of his work, at thenation.com. Let me ask you, in light of what you just said about Frederick Douglass, if you have done any political calculations about calling the Constitution trash in the year of midterm elections, when wokeness and critical race theory and all sorts of other cultural bugaboos seem to be the main platform of the Republican Party.
Sure. So one of the things that's been interesting as I've been on the book tour, right, is people saying like, well, you're not going to convince Republicans with language like this. I'm like, who in the hell told you that I was interested in convincing Republicans? Like, I've got, trying to save Republicans is somebody else's job. It ain't mine. I'm trying to inspire Democrats, right? As I said at the beginning, guide is an operative word in my title. I want Democrats to read this. I want liberals to read this. I want progressives to read this and think a little bit differently about how we fight back against the Republican onslaught and capturing of our third branch of government. So, for instance, in my abortion chapter, which I call the abortion chapter, because unlike some Democrats, I'm not afraid to say the word abortion. So,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
my
yeah.
abortion chapter, I say like, no, we shouldn't call the people who are anti-choice pro-life. We should call them forced birth because that's what they're doing. And if you look at it from a constitutional perspective, the forced birth argument should be illegal under the Eighth Amendment's ban against cruel and unusual punishment.
Mm-hmm.
It should be illegal under the 14th Amendment's grants of equal protection of rights. And if you push me, it should be illegal under the 13th Amendment's ban against forced labor. Because that's what it says, right? What you're doing is telling a woman against her will for no remuneration that she has to work for the state because the state has a vested in. Are you kidding me? We don't do that without pay in this country. We fought a war over that. So trying to change the Overton window, right? In terms of
Yep. And
how,
explain to folks what the Overton window is.
so that's the Overton window is just the scope of what you're allowed to talk about, of what you're allowed to say. And what Republicans have done very well is shift that window to the right and to the right and to the right. And so we're always kind of, even when we beat Republicans, we're debating on their terms,
That's
right?
right.
A great example of this for your listeners is what happened with the healthcare debate, right? So right now the healthcare debate is whether or not we should have no national healthcare, which is what the Republicans argue, or if we should have healthcare controlled by insurance companies so that everybody has a right to buy health insurance. That's what Obamacare is, right? The debate of like, should the government just pay for healthcare, which is what they do in just about every other civilized, wealthy democracy. That's not even part of the real conversation anymore, right? That's an example of the Republicans successfully shifting the Overton window. Part of what I'm trying to do in this book is shift the Overton window a little bit back to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And to expand the field of what's allowable to think, what's allowable to say, and what's allowable to debate, which is why I've been using these strong provocative terms like trash and not good. I'm trying to shift it back a little bit because, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, I always like this analogy. Democrats think that if the Republicans put an elephant on one side of the seesaw, that the way to balance the seesaw is to stand right in the middle. And I'm like, that's idiotic. If you stand in the middle, you're just going to slide down to the side of the elephant. If you want to balance the seesaw, you got to put an elephant on the other side. That's how seesaws work.
Yep.
And that's how Overton windows work. And my book is a strong as I can be on the other side of the Republican arguments.
Yep. And I guess the other thing to remember is that this idea of arguing on Republican turf is such a deeply held and actually well-practiced part of their strategy and has been probably forever. But to me, I look at so many things as, the early 70s. Milton Friedman defining the only goal of a corporation is to increase shareholder value, and the Powell memo saying we've got to get busy and get business to get more involved and get a federalist society to change the course and so on. That it's a long-term plan, and it is worked at day after day, year after year. Let me jump to one other thing I want to throw in here because it's very foundational to what you do in the book, which is that you actually want people not just to think about the Constitution differently, but to think about the law differently. You make a couple of statements. I treat the law as an argument. The law is not science, it's jazz. I think this is another area where you're sort of demystifying and removing from hallowed, ground the law.
100%. And I get it. The people think that the law is objective. They want it to come down from on high, and there's a right answer and a wrong answer like it's math. It's just not. That's just not how it works. There isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. There is a lot of gray. The system itself is adversarial, which means there's always another side of the argument. That's just how the system is designed to work, right? So who is interpreting the law is just as important as what the law says in our system. So I think that instead of kind of always fighting over what the law says, which can be up for interpretation and is, like I said, the kind of end result of an argument, we should fight a little bit harder for who gets to decide. Because who gets to decide is going to have a much bigger effect on outcomes than I think most people realize, right? If you got me judging cases, like
Yeah.
that's going to come out a lot differently than Ben Shapiro judging cases, right? Even though we're reading the same text, right? He's going to interpret that text one way. I'm going to interpret that text in a completely different way. He's going to interpret equal protection as equal protection for white people. I'm going to interpret equal protection as equal protection for women, right? That's just going to be a difference in how we attack that same clause in the argument, right? So I think that people need to, again, if you read the book, one of the things that I try very hard to do is to take the jargon out of it, right? I don't write from a coming from a hierarchical sense. I don't write coming down on high. When I have to use jargon, I spend a lot of time explaining what that jargon actually means. I'm not going to say the law isn't complicated. It's complicated, but it's not beyond the reach of most people, right? Most literate people should be able to read it and understand it. And the reason why we can't so often is because lawyers and judges hide behind a lot of jargon, partially to make themselves look smart. So I really try to take that out in the book. I try to demystify just what's actually going on, because I believe that if people understood the law a little bit better, they would be more outraged by what Republicans are trying to do to it.
Yeah, and I think it is in not just in the service of the law industry, but in service of the conservatives and the Republicans to keep this idea of the law, as you described it, in place. That the starting point is that there is something like the law, and we've got to be subject to it. I think that notion. One thing that's interesting, and I just invite listeners to think about this, is that there's three things, or there's at least three things, but there's of three things that really matter in your life. One is the law, the other is your finances, and the other is your health. And if you think about it, those three industries do everything they can to speak and put their information out in such a way that you are less able to understand it than they are.
I think that's right, Terrence. But I like to go in this. This is my triumvirate, right?
Sure.
There are three branches of government. The president can't burp without 5 reporters there to explain it, analyze it, bring in new perspectives. Was this burp a sign to Putin? News at 11, right? Like people will do a deep dive if the president shambles. Okay. Other branch of government, Congress, again, you got Capitol Hill reporters, you got people chasing senators down the hallway, chasing congressmen down the hallway, to say nothing of the fact that every few weeks the senators stop working,
yes,
go home to their district and talk to you and talk to donors, but also talk to you, but really talk to donors, and try to explain what they're doing in Washington and why it's important. You have the third branch of government, the courts, that is just as important as the other two, has just as much power as the other two. I argue is in some ways more powerful than the other two, because the Supreme Court can veto straight up acts of Congress signed by the president whenever it wants. So you've got this amazingly powerful third branch of government, and basically nobody knows how it works. Nobody knows what it's doing. Nobody understands what it's doing. You don't have reporters crawling out of every orifice of First Street, which is the building where the Supreme Court is. Most people, even people who live in D.C., don't know what's on First Street. Don't even know it's there.
Yeah, yeah.
John Roberts could be behind. Like if you're a listener and you're listening to this in your earbuds while you're grocery shopping, John Roberts, this Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, could be standing behind you in line, and 80% of you wouldn't know who it was.
It's
Right?
true.
Like,
It's true. It's true. Now,
that's
now,
a problem from where I sit.
Yeah, let me take that a step further, which is that, do you suspect this conversation that I referred to in the introduction that just, I mean, because as you're saying, we don't know what's going on with the Supreme Court. It seems that in the news lately, we're trying to know just a little more, right? I do see that. There is more attention to the Supreme Court and less faith in the Supreme Court. And this question of ethics, that the Supreme Court doesn't have the rules Congress has, doesn't have the rule the executive branch has about ethics and so on, doesn't have the rules other judges or even federal judges have. Is that partially because, they're high and mighty and we don't need to know what's going on behind the curtain?
It's partially because of that. It's partially because the people haven't demanded that the Supreme Court have ethics rules because they don't understand what the Supreme Court does. Again, according to the court, only its individual justices can determine what's ethical for them. That's their literal stance on this issue. I brought up before that Brett Kavanaugh, aside from the attempted rape allegations, had 83 ethics complaints brought against him. And they were thrown out of court, not because there was any finding of fact about the ethics complaint, but simply because the court said they have no mechanism to punish a sitting Supreme Court justice. So that those 83 ethics complaints, while Brett Kavanaugh was on the D.C. Circuit, the courts could maybe do something because he was on a lower court. But once he got to the Supreme Court, they had to throw out these 83 complaints because there was just nothing anybody could do to him.
Wow, so that's quite similar to me, Ellie. That's quite similar to me, to Mueller not being willing to state that Trump had committed obstruction of justice because of the norm that the Justice Department wouldn't arrest a sitting president. Right? In other words,
it's institutionalists. Exactly, it's institutionalists protecting their own. So now, when you look at this current Jenny Thomas story,
right,
folks, Jenny Thomas has been a messy problem for 30 years.
Yep.
This has been her whole career, doing these kinds of things. And Clarence Thomas has been compromised because of it for 30 years. Clarence Thomas has been on the Supreme Court since 1991. He has not recused from a case. He has not recused himself from a case for 30 years. And nobody can stop him. Right? Like, the only way to punish, remove, do anything to a Supreme Court justice, according to the Constitution, is through the impeachment process of Congress, and we know how likely that is to work in our, if you couldn't convict Donald Trump,
right, for the insurrection,
for the Ukraine, like, if you couldn't convict him for that, then how are you going to get Clarence Thomas? How are you going to get Brett Kavanaugh with Republicans in the Senate? You're not going to, right? But Congress hasn't tried all of its tools, because the Constitution says very clearly that Congress sets up the rules for the Supreme Court and all other courts. Congress could try passing an ethics law that would affect the Supreme Court. They could also try passing an ethics law that would affect Congress. I will note, Terrence, that H.R. 1, which was the big voting rights reform and ethics reform bill that didn't get out of Congress because of Joe Manchin and the filibuster. You'll note that Joe Manchin later changed H.R. 1 into the Freedom to Vote Act, which was just the voting rights stuff and whatever. What did we lose between the H.R. 1 and the Freedom to Vote Act? All of the ethical requirements that were supposed to be in H.R. 1.
That's right. As I recall, when H.R. 1 was first developed, and I remember Represent US was one of the groups, and there were other groups that were pushing this forward, it was called the Anti-Corruption Act. It was not the Freedom to Vote Act. It was about corruption.
Exactly. It was about making sure that a person running for president had to release their taxes, making sure that a person who was president couldn't direct money to themselves or their family businesses. A bunch of reform, defining what emoluments means, like a bunch of reforms that we kind of desperately need.
Yep.
That's what Joe Manchin didn't want in his bill, folks.
Yeah, and that's that.
Joe Manchin why.
By the way, it is that kind of nuance that never kind of makes it through the media. As much as they focus on Joe Manchin and probably built his ego and his fundraising, that kind of specific where you go, well, what did he actually do here? Almost never gets through this kind of thing. Let me ask. We've got about 10 minutes, Ellie. So let me ask for a couple of specifics about specific amendments, perhaps, and then finally, I want to finish with what sort of reforms do you propose, and how could they be achieved? So first, let's go with just the First and Second Amendment. So the First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion, and so on. What are some of the points you make in the book?
Well, that the First Amendment's grant of freedom of exercise of religion is not the same as a grant of freedom for bigotry.
That's right.
Right? That just because you claim that your God wants you to be a bigot isn't a good enough reason to allow you to be a bigot in the public sphere. You want to go home, privacy of your own home, and be bigoted to people, nobody can stop you. Nobody's going to stop you. But once you step out of that house and you enter the stream of commerce, your bigotry is no longer allowed or respected. And that's important since there's apparently a lot of people who think that it's okay, because of God, to be bigoted to gay people every time they want to throw a party, and that's just that's not constitutionally protected, or at least it shouldn't be, and that's one of the important things to understand about the First Amendment.
One of the points you make is that only certain people are protected. There is a thing called protected speech. Explain that, because it's pretty simple, but it's just not well known.
Yeah, so the constitutional doctrine around speech and around equal protection laws looks particularly at protected classes. Those are classes that have been historically kind of singled out for discrimination or other challenges. So like Black people are a protected class. LGBTQ people are maybe a protected class, perhaps a quasi-protected class. Women are a quasi-protected class. Like there's a bunch of jargony definitions for what this means, but it basically means that white people are not, and that's
yeah. And the other thing in this same the two pieces of this, one is who is protected, the other is whose speech matters, and it turns out that the First Amendment does not mean that a magazine can't say bad things about you. It means that the government can't restrict your right to speech.
Right. It means that the government can't shutter the magazine for saying bad things about the president. That's what the First Amendment is really there for. The First Amendment is not concerned with private speech. It just really isn't, right? It's concerned with government and legal retribution for unpopular speech, and particularly unpopular political speech. So that's your cancel culture, right? And we're seeing it all the time, right? When a public school bans a book, that's a problem for the First Amendment, all right? When a New York Times columnist gets ratioed on Twitter, that's not a problem for the First Amendment.
That's right. That's the thing. And I'm going to a couple of your quotes. Those who claim to care about cancel culture treat political protest as the thing that threatens freedom of speech. They claim their freedoms are being threatened by the very thing the First Amendment is designed to protect.
Yep. I quote in my book the Julie Brinksman story. She's the person who flipped off the presidential motorcade, got sued. That's a problem with the First Amendment. Desiree Farouz laughed during Jeff Sessions' confirmation hearing when Sessions eventually was confirmed. He prosecuted or tried to prosecute Farouz. That's a problem for the First Amendment. But J.K. Rowling getting yelled at on Twitter, not a problem. Roseanne Barr losing a TV show, not a problem. Andrew Sullivan losing a column, not a problem. The cancel culture is what happens when the government censors speech. That's cancel culture.
That's right.
When regular people get yelled at or shamed or shunned for saying something stupid, that's not cancel culture. That's just real life.
That's right. And by the way, even if you don't think what they said was stupid, it's still not protected by the First Amendment. As you say, Right here, it's very clear. Constitutional protections of speech are mainly concerned with government's attempts to silence or punish views the ruling party doesn't like. That's what the First Amendment's about. That's what free
I
speech is
don't
about.
like it when I'm on Tucker Carlson, when Tucker Carlson uses a quote of mine out of context and then his crazy MAGA people come and threaten my life on Twitter. I don't like that. I don't like it when Ben Shapiro says bad things about me, but I'm not being canceled.
That's right.
I'm just fighting with yahoos on Twitter.
That's right.
That's that's
Okay.
part of my job that I chose.
Second Amendment. Your chapter, I believe, is called "Everything You Know About the Second Amendment Is Wrong" or something quite like that.
Right. Yeah, so really quickly, the right to own a gun for personal self-defense is a right that Republicans invented in 2008 in a case called DC versus Heller. That was not a constitutional right before that. That was not the constitutional understanding of the Second Amendment at the founding. At the founding, the understanding was that we needed the Second Amendment to stop slave revolts. Literally, the governor of Virginia, George Mason, gives a speech where he says that the problem that the South had was that there were certain pockets in the South where the slaves outnumbered the white people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally those pockets would rise up and revolt because it's hard to keep a people in bondage against their will. The principal way at the founding of putting down those slave revolts was to raise the militia. It's very Roman the way they went about things, right? But the well-regulated militia was there not to fight King George, but to put down slave revolts, right?
And,
well,
and let me jump in quickly, Ellie, because that was news to me in reading the book. And I'd certainly read a lot about the Second Amendment, but I just had missed that point. How clearly can you establish that fact? Can you quote George Mason?
I can quote George Mason and Patrick Henry giving speeches to the Virginia House of Delegates during the fight between the Federalists who didn't want amendments to the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison, and the Anti-Federalists, of which Mason and Henry were leaders. They say that slavery is detested in the North, and they say that if the North is allowed to raise the militia, they might not raise and discipline the militia, thus leaving the South exposed to the revolt of enslaved people. They actually give a speech where they say that, and thus they need the Second Amendment so that they can discipline their own militias and deal with their own slave problems.
So that line about the well-regulated militia was about tracking down slaves. And for Scalia, that line doesn't even exist. He transferred it completely to the right for any individual to have a weapon, and then that becomes all these crazy conceal carry, just the Wild West that's happening. Okay, how do we change things? And you got 2 minutes.
You gotta have more justices. I'm a big believer in court expansion. I love court expansion so much. I don't even care what they call it, court packing. Just whatever you want to call it what you want. We need more Supreme Court justices. For the first reason I've already mentioned, if we're going to say that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter on what is constitutional and what is not, then that Supreme Court needs to be bigger and more representative of the people who live in this country. 9 is just too small of a number. I support adding 20 justices so we have a 29-person Supreme Court. Does that sound too big to you? It shouldn't. That's how big the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is in California. They have 29 justices. California, Washington State, Oregon, Arizona works just fine. All right, so we should have a 29-person Supreme Court. Not only would that allow for more kind of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity, it would also allow for more professional diversity, which, again, if the Supreme Court's going to have this outsized power, which I will just note is not a power shared by the high courts in most parts of the world, right? The Canada Supreme Court is not coming in and vetoing acts of parliament. That's us, folks. So if we're going to have that kind of power, we need more diversity on those from those people.
And one other point you make about that is that there would be less of this political battle about every justice if there were 29. With 9, and we get your 6-3 or your 5-4. Every single thing becomes a battle royale.
Exactly. Everybody has to go to the mattresses every time one of these octogenarians dies or retires, which is ridiculous. Well, if you had a greatly expanded Supreme Court, the Supreme Court would have just as much power, but each individual justice would be far less powerful, thus perhaps fixing our broken confirmation process. So that's another great reform reason. And the last great reform reason is simply this. Now, I'm a crazy lefty. I want crazy lefty decisions, but most people say that they want mainstream decisions, center mass, nothing too extreme on either side. Well, how do you get more mainstream opinions? By appointing more moderate justices? Well, we found that we don't really know. We can't really do that, and people don't even know what moderate is in the judicial context. So that's a red herring argument. But if you want more moderate decisions, add more people. Because if you've ever tried to get 5 people together, like we have right now in the Supreme Court, you know that you can get 5 people to do just about anything, right? But if you need to get 15 people together to go out to dinner or something, right? 15 people, they're going to go to Applebee's, man. They're going to go to the Olive Garden. They're going to go to some kind of anodyne, mainstream, bland place because herding cats is difficult. 15 people to get a majority opinion, with the law being as complicated as it is, with people being as different as they are, a plus 15 person decision would be very narrow and very moderate and very mainstream if you're interested in that kind of stuff on the Supreme Court.
Okay, and I'm going to throw in one more, and then I've got to close the conversation, which is that you also favor term limits. Although the Constitution says they serve for life, there is something in some of the federal courts, I believe, where you sort of have a different after a certain number of years, you become a less
Take what's
powerful
called senior status.
Yeah. Okay.
I support term limits. I think there's a way to do it constitutionally without a constitutional amendment, but the best way to do that is to give me 20 justices who agree with me, and then bam, you can have your term limits.
That's right. And all the other things, the things we talked about, ethics and so on, it all gets a little easier when this isn't this precious 9-person people who rule over the entire country. We got to let it go at that, but there's, as you can imagine, so much more to talk about. The book is Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. You'll learn a lot more about ELIE MYSTAL's work by looking to thenation.com. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to get my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 10 articles, relevant and timely, flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform Podcast on Apple Podcasts and most other podcast sites. You will find years of podcasts, really like 10 years worth. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, on and on. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, ELIE MYSTAL, and keep up your good work.
Thank you so much for having me, Terrence.